Hold on. Hold on. I'm having some. Hold on. I think I'm live. Hold on. I have some issue with Facebook. Okay. It's okay. Hey, everyone. We are live. Happy Friday. And welcome to the weekly show of What is School For? My name is Dr. I. I'm the CEO of Classroom Without Walls and the host of this weekly live streaming show. On this show, I interview leading education professionals, entrepreneurs, business leaders, parents, and students to discuss, debate, and disrupt education. And our goal is to future proof the next generation on this show called What is School For? Today, I'm really excited and honored to have Xander MacSwan on the show to talk about unschooling and his experience growing up as an unschooler and having unlimited access to playing video games, just lots of autonomy and freedom to do what he wants to do, what he wants to learn, which sounds really exciting. And so really excited to learn more about this. For those of you who have been following my journey, you know that I'm an education disruptor. I quit my college professor position to disrupt education in a way that I think is more aligned with the way that children are learning. And in my own homeschooling effort, my husband and I, we incorporated different elements of unschooling into our own approach. But I'm definitely not an expert on unschooling. And so I'm really excited to learn from Xander and his first-hand experience as an unschooler. And as always, we are live on all the social media channels. And we're even live on Amazon Live. I highly recommend that you guys join us live on Amazon Live, where you can see a list of books related to disruptive education, homeschooling, unschooling. So definitely join us live. If you just enter Classroom Without Walls.live, and you will be able to catch us live on Amazon Live. And as always, a big shout out to StreamYard for being a sponsor of the show. StreamYard is my favorite third-party tool to go live. And if you are new to StreamYard, check out my discount code in the comment section which will allow you to try out StreamYard for free for 2 weeks. So without any further ado, Xander, welcome to the show.
Thanks, it's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, honored. So really excited. I actually interviewed your mom, which is exciting. That's how I discovered you. I also interviewed Unschooling Mom to Mom. And also interviewed Dr. Peter Gray. So I have interviewed quite a few people talking about unschooling, but I think you are the very first kind of student who grow up as an unschooler. So I'm really excited for today's conversation. So to kick things off, share with us, how did you discover unschooling, or how did you even get started on this journey as an unschooler?
Yeah, so that story for me, like you alluded to, is probably different than it would be for a parent, because I wasn't in a way, I wasn't the initial decision maker, right? Like my mom found unschooling and thought it would be a really powerful thing for our family. There's a story that she, likes to tell, and that was impactful to my life about some of the ways that school was just really not clicking with me and my siblings and our family. And I think there was a particular final straw when I wanted to stay in on Halloween one night to study and do homework instead of go trick-or-treating. And to my mom, that was really heartbreaking. She thought, this is causing, well, one, kind of a divide between sort of school and like our family, our traditions and our ways of being. And also it seemed really clear in that moment that this sort of active school we were doing was not aligned with or in service to our passion, which my mom knows, as we'll speak more about as we go. The passion is, at least in the unschooling view, the really key kind of central element of learning.
Yeah, so thanks for sharing that. Yeah, so was it hard for you to transition from like being a traditional school student to all of a sudden to this like unschooling? Did you go through like different phases? And do you mind sharing that with us?
Of course. Yeah. Yes and no. So the kind of initial, moment for me, I was in, I think, 5th grade. I was relatively young. And for me, when I heard, my parents say, um, kids, would you like to leave school? Would you like to instead have all of your time be free time? It was a pretty easy yes for me. On one hand, I was young enough that I hadn't sort of been exposed to the kind of big set of cultural ideas that you have to go to school to succeed, to kind of get anywhere in your life, to have joy or be able to contribute. And so to me, it was just this really kind of uh, meaningless chore going to school. Like, I didn't associate it with anything impactful or profound. And it was just this kind of set of tasks I did every day without really wanting to or understanding why. And so given the option of freedom, it was just a really easy choice. That said, I did go through some phases with kind of the withdrawal period. There's a lot to that that's really interesting to unpack. I can get into it now, or if you have any other kind of initial questions you want to ask, either way.
Yeah, I think you are talking about this. You can just share this with us now. Yeah, I'd love
Great.
to hear the phases. Yeah.
So in unschooling, we talk about this as kind of the deschooling process, which is when you first leave school as an unschooler, there's a period of time where you're still kind of acculturated or acclimated to this way of existing, where you are dependent on and expecting influence from external power sources. So for most kids, that means having been taught so thoroughly to respond only to authority, to kind of suppress our internal creative impulses, and instead wait for instruction from teachers or principals or whatever it might be. But there's this long period of time where we have all this freedom and we don't know sort of what to do with it. And so one of the really common trends we see during this kind of deschooling period is kids will turn to kind of familiar comforts of things that they would have done after school, things like video games, things like television. And so for some parents, this can be really alarming.
Yes.
Because it can appear as though, oh no, I've given my kid all this freedom and they're only doing these mindless things of video games and television. I've made a huge mistake. So I really want to encourage parents, don't be afraid. It's kind of a normal psychological part of the process, and there can be a lot of benefit to sort of what's happening as you take a deeper look at it.
That's incredible. I mean, that is something that my husband and we struggle with almost on a daily basis, because I think even though I feel like I'm pretty disruptive when it comes to education, but still when your children are just sitting there playing games, you're like, what do we do to our kids? Is this like, are we like I think we still go through that like on almost on a daily basis. So you mentioned there are also potential benefits to this process. Do you mind elaborate a little bit on this? Because I think that is something most parents are, we love our kids, but at the same time, like a little bit concerned. So can you share the benefits of this deschooling process? It's like even they are just like sitting in front of TV, like doing nothing. Yeah.
Yeah. So I totally, and first I want to give at least my understanding of kind of the psychology of what's happening for a kid going through that process, which is there's this really key shift to understand between the way a kid engages with material like television and video games when they go to school, and a shift towards kind of how a kid engages with that material as an unschooler. So it's important to remember that for kids who go to school, they're undergoing consistent and ongoing, intellectual suppression, and in general, this kind of like broad deconstruction of their sort of creative selves and their sort of passionate energy as a human being and learner. And like we talked about earlier, instead being kind of taught to respond to authority, do sort of rote memorization, all of their sort of individuality and creativity is being left aside. So that can be pretty emotionally traumatizing for a kid, that process. And so for kids who go to school, oftentimes their sort of going home process is one that's defined by being exhausted from kind of putting their minds through this sort of unfamiliar and ultimately unhealthy kind of forced set of moves. And then emotionally exhausted from kind of being inauthentic to themselves throughout the day. And so they're kind of like slouched. They might look a little bit depressed, and they're like looking at the TV as kind of like their way of coping almost with like the really, legitimate difficulty of their daily life.
Yeah.
Now, when you first become an unschooler and you're going through this deschooling process, that initially continues. At first, you're still, as a kid, just because someone flipped a switch and told you, you were free, that doesn't undo immediately all of the trauma and, rewiring of your brain that happened in your first however many years of school. So there's going to be some period of time of emotional and intellectual recovery. And that's, I think, the way to view deschooling as a period is as recovery, is as a kid kind of like shutting down and like slowing down their life and giving themselves space to kind of like rest and slowly reconstruct their identity, their way of learning, their way of engaging with their lives.
Yeah, I love it. It's like an internal healing journey, and I love the way you described it. And we have quite a few questions from the live audience.
Sure.
First is here. So, what do your friends and family members think of this? Like, you left school, 5th grade. Are there like any like friends feeling concerned or stigma that you had to deal with?
Yeah. So, I, as a kid, there's a lot of elements to that question, so I'll try to get to them one at a time. I found it pretty easy and I think I got a lot of support from my parents to find a new community going into unschooling. My mom particularly really actively networked with other homeschooling and unschooling families in our area. And really before much time had passed, really as I was kind of just getting to the end of that deschooling process, there was this sort of new set of community and resources. I started going to park days with local homeschoolers, and that felt really satisfying. There are, and this is a common experience for unschoolers, elements of usually strife, particularly within family. And so for me, there was this period of time where my grandparents, who were a really kind of close part of our family unit, they lived with us, and I'd spend a lot of my time during the day with them while my parents worked. My grandparents were skeptical of unschooling. They were much more comfortable with this kind of traditional idea of school and wanted some sort of structural guarantee in the form of a diploma that I'd be able to have something, some resource, for my future. And they weren't really ready to sort of trust in the value of like intellectual and emotional health being the foundation of letting a kid go and achieve greatness. They wanted something, a stamp from society that was more to them. And so it was a process. But I think because I was so close with my grandparents, in a way, it didn't take them long to just observe me and my siblings. And they probably still had some concern in that initial deschooling process. It's tough to watch a depressed kid. And I think as soon as we came out of that and started engaging in our creativity and our passion, and kind of opening up and finding new avenues of learning and expression, our grandparents saw that and kind of like responded to it positively. And so, one thing is for family members who are distant from your family, and probably some parents can relate to this, it's easy for them without really seeing or knowing your kids to think, oh, those kids must not be learning anything, you know. But for adults who've sat down and talked to unschoolers, they usually find out really quickly, oh, this kid's smart. This kid's like engaged and really like authentic and connected to themselves, and they believe in what they're saying, which are traits that you don't usually see in kids who are growing up in the school system. So
Yeah.
partly exposure goes a long way.
Yeah, I love that. And interesting because Xander, you mentioned earlier that you were not even like struggling, school was okay for you. It's so interesting to hear that for someone like you still had to go through this deschooling. Probably lots of things surfaced that you didn't even realize before. So how long was this deschooling experience? Like how long did this process last for you? And
Yeah.
after you finished the deschooling process, what are some of the bigger changes that you observed in yourself?
Yeah. So again, a few notes there to kind of initially give an answer to your main question. I like to assume a timeline of something like 1 year. It can be a long time. And again, just kind of think about as a parent, that's your kid's recovery process from many more years in a system that was deconstructing them to the detriment of their emotional health. But to answer your other questions, I want to also quickly address there's this kind of idea of kids who do well in school. And I want to talk a little bit about that. So I, at the time, was kind of in the classical view, a successful student when I was in elementary school. I was getting A's. I was in the advanced placement program. Like I was succeeding in sort of the school version of the sense. That doesn't necessarily mean that I was more emotionally healthy than my fellow students. Whereas, my siblings or other students who may have had different experiences with school, who maybe didn't have the very specific kind of kind of like mental approach to problem solving that led to success in school. They might have been like bullied or looked down on by their teachers. I didn't necessarily have that problem, but I did have a lot of internal, sort of perfectionism wreaking havoc through me, and a lot of kind of other ideas that also like were me internalizing this necessary response to authority. And I don't want to necessarily compare traumas or anything like that, but just noting that the kind of fundamental process that kids are going through is likely to be an unhealthy one. Whether they're sort of succeeding in school is very different from whether they're happy in school.
Yeah.
And so with that aside, I want to then get to the other part of your question. So I talked earlier about this shift that happens in unschoolers, the deschooling process. And usually there's this kind of one really special moment that happens in an unschooling family where your kid who's been deschooling for a year and watching TV, playing video games, doing whatever it is their coping mechanism might be, will suddenly one morning walk up to their parent and say, Mom, I want to learn how to make pancakes. Can you show me? Or it's usually some kind of simple question. It's some like basic skill. And what's kind of happened in that moment is a kid's healing process has proceeded sufficiently that their kind of innate curiosity and creativity have re-engaged as kind of the prevailing forces in their inner landscape. And so it starts with simple questions to their parents, and then progresses very quickly to larger and more complex questions about the world and seeking classes and companions in learning. And this kind of self-led approach to learning starts to unfold.
Yeah, I love how this is like just naturally emerges. I really love it. So this is such a beautiful process. So can you share with us how has growing up as an unschooler like really affected or influenced what you do today? And maybe you can also tell us more about what you are doing today And from what I saw online, it seems like you're an entrepreneur, but I can be wrong. But share with us what you are doing today and how has this educational path really prepared you for what you are doing today?
Yeah. So there's a few other podcasts I've done floating around online, and most of them center on kind of my experience of video games.
And also, I'm going to ask that later. Yes.
Yeah, and how kind of those contributed to my worldview, and how unschooling contributed to my worldview. And to kind of just summarize very briefly, I think unschooling gave me an opportunity to ask broader questions that I think are, at least in my view, really, really meaningful for kids to be kind of given space to ask. Things like kind of what kind of world do I want to live in? How do I want to contribute to this world? What kind of gifts do I have that I can share? And so where I think it's totally happens that kids in school, ask those questions, they aren't necessarily given space to, come up with and act on answers. And so for me, I had a lot of support in the form of time and freedom, and a lot of support in the form of encouragement, from my family. And so I took those questions of, how can I contribute meaningfully to the world? And I did a very unschoolery thing, which is I just kind of embraced my creativity and my curiosity, and I went out into the world and started trying ideas. And so my first idea was, what the world needs? The world needs a really good yoga teacher. And so I went out and tried to learn to be a yoga teacher. I had this really awesome training program, and it continues to influence me. But as kind of happens, on the unschooler path, where there's this kid unintuitively following the scientific process, I tested that idea of kind of contributing to the world through teaching yoga. I saw some holes in it that I didn't enjoy, saw some successes in it that I did enjoy, and I went on to test my next idea. I eventually ended up in this really awesome program called the Oregon Prison Project up in Portland, where my career centered on teaching classes in nonviolence to inmates in state prisons, just partly influenced by nonviolent philosophy from yoga, partly influenced from a few other experiments I had done along the way. But my period of, it's still going now, but from when I turned 18 to today, I sort of view that time as a series of experiments I've done as an adult in kind of testing out ways of contributing to the world and seeing, what gives me meaning, what is fulfilling, what is kind of, what gives me the means I need, usually in form of money, to kind of keep going. And one thing I noticed when I kind of look at my life next to those who peers of mine who went to a more traditional educational path is they've kind of like picked a career, whatever their degree was in or whatever their high school degree was in, and they're sticking to it. And a lot of them are kind of miserable. They're making money, but they're very unhappy, and they really dislike their work life. They regret the sort of choice they made of what career to get into. They want to change, but they've already invested so much time and money into this path that they're kind of in the sunk cost fallacy, and they keep going, misery or not. Unschooling, at least as a mentality, has at least given me a chance to kind of dip my toes in with this kind of curious element. So one really key thing, one difference between unschoolers and school kids, is that unschoolers are really taught and experientially to value failure, to value kind of like trial and error as a form of learning, whereas school kids are taught that a failure is the end. Like you failed the test, you are no longer successful, you're a waste of breath, whatever it is, that kind of internalized story of failure. Unschoolers like me were kind of encouraged to this perspective where we go out and try things, we learn from our failures rather than be crushed by them. So this kind of like approach to young adulthood allows us to get a little bit more experiential, get our hands dirty, learn, take notes from what we've tried. Does that kind of answer your question, Ai?
Yeah, definitely. I love how you said that unschoolers really appreciate like failures and mistakes. And that is something I observed because I was mainly teaching traditional school students and how afraid they are. Not even a big mistake, but just losing 1 point. They were like
Yeah.
so stressed out. So interesting to hear that, unschoolers in general, they embrace more of failures and mistakes. And what you said reminds me of this. There was a big study that came out, I think last year, a few years ago, saying that 85% of people, full-time working professionals, actually hate their job. Like I was like, what? So they interviewed 2 billion or 1, like large sample. I was like, wow, that is a very high percentage. And when I look around, many of my friends, in fact, before I resigned, I was very unhappy for sure, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
So really nice to hear that. And yes, you are right, because I think Phil was also talking about you invested so much in like tuition, everything that by the time you graduate, it's too late. And
You're
I
on the
love
track. You got to keep going.
exactly. I love how you mentioned as unschoolers, you can try, yoga, like try different ways. And even about with us, like homeschooling, like we can immediately change, oh, this is working, that is not working. And oftentimes I think, oh wow, if my kids were at school, changing from one major to another one, it just will take forever, right? Like taking all the courses,
Yeah.
it's lots of hurdles. So very interesting to hear that perspective. And I remembered in one of the interviews, you mentioned that you skip college. Is that right? So can you tell us more about that? How do
Yes,
you make
yes
that
and
decision?
no. So I'm in college now. I'm a student currently.
Okay.
But I did initially, I didn't go kind of the typical age time frame of going to college when I was 18. And I think that was a really important part of my life path because kind of going with what we've just been talking about, I had a lot more freedom. I wasn't invested into heavy duty student loans that really might limit kind of the flexibility I have in my life as a young adult. So I, without something like loans to think about, I was able to live very inexpensively and kind of try out ideas. I started some businesses, led workshops, tried different ideas of how I could kind of be an entrepreneur and, make ideas happen with a little bit more kind of like on a very small financial scale, where I didn't feel like I had to pay off these big loans. And I didn't feel like I had already kind of over-invested into one idea of how to be in the world. I could test out these different ideas like we've been talking about. And then as kind of a conclusion to my experiments, I found through my working with the Oregon Prison Project that it's just really meaningful to me as just uniquely me as a person to sit in the classroom and to talk about things like worldviews and perspectives. And without going too much into the details of the kind of story, that's led me to being a student again and kind of on this trajectory towards actually a professorship.
Wow.
And that's like become a career that feels really meaningful and exciting to me. And I think partly because I've taken the time to test it and do things similar to it and find that of all the things I've tried, that's what's really been delightful to me and the way I've been able to most contribute.
Yeah, I love it. And eventually you will just be like your mom, become a
Sure.
professor.
Yeah, maybe.
I love it, but it's so different, right? So when I became a college professor, I really had no idea. I like someone asked me, is there something I'm really passionate about? I was like, I don't know, because I never actually tried anything else outside the classroom. I was like, just a traditional student from primary school, middle school, high school,
Sure,
college,
yeah.
master degree, PhD, started teaching. I was like, I really never asked myself, like, is this something I wanted to do? Is this something I'm really passionate about? Just like a journey, just like traditional school curriculum, right? This journey is given to you, take it forward. So
Yeah.
yeah. So how has, you took a break from like learning or like school-based learning, like coming back to the classroom, like how does it feel? Like strange, or was it hard for you to adapt because you were away from classroom for quite a few years? So
Yeah,
how did you readapt?
it's definitely strange. Um, and there's been kind of this process of relearning how sort of school works.
Mm.
Um, one really, this might be funny to some people. When I first came back to college after my years doing more independent unschoolery learning, uh, I it didn't really make sense to me. There's this idea in that's common among, I think, college students and probably college professors too, where students are going to kind of do the minimum assigned work, because they aren't really there to learn. They're there to get their points, and get out, so to speak. That didn't make sense to me intuitively. I was an unschooler, and I had been taught to love learning rather than to be scared of it.
Mm.
And so when I stepped into a classroom, it was my first class coming back was a philosophy 101 course. And I found myself, reading the textbook chapter and then listening to podcasts and doing Google searches. I was just diving into the material because I was there to learn. That's what made sense to me. So I wanted to get as much out of it as I could. And I would write these multiple page discussion posts that were way overkill for the Canvas assignment. Didn't make any sense. And so, kind of in the time since then, I've learned to scale back a little bit to be appropriate in the context of the classes I'm in. But I think that's an interesting point to kind of illustrate the difference in intuitive orientation towards learning between an unschooler and a college student, or sorry, unschooler and a high school student.
Yeah, because you learn, you enjoy this, right? Like
Yeah.
most students are like, yeah, as you mentioned, the bare minimum so that they can just like move on their life and just like they treat that as a chore. But in your case, you're really enjoying this process. So do
Yeah.
you like feel like you have this like burning desire to learn in almost every single class?
Yes. There are assignments that I find frustrating, or interactions with teachers that annoy me. Like I have little gripes, like anyone in any kind of professional context. But I think by and large, in kind of a broad view, I think I really enjoy my classes, and I'm able to kind of meaningfully grow from my classes. I think, again, another comparison is most students in college who have come straight from high school are again in this mentality where they're doing the bare minimum. And one thing that kind of translates to is they're, just memorizing enough material to pass the test, and they aren't really relating to it from a place of passion. That's kind of the whole thing with unschooling, is we know that when a person's engaging with material from a place of passion and genuine curiosity, they just light up. Like they start to grow. They start to integrate material. They start to just change and evolve into a more beautiful human being. Sir Ken Robinson gives a really excellent talk about that kind of paradigm shift. And that's just as true in college. And the interesting thing that's different about college from high school is college gives you at least some semblance of the opportunity to choose classes that interest you. And so it kind of gives you some tools to engage in the context of your passion. Because I'm not forced to take classes that I'm not interested in generally. It's been easier, at least, for me to kind of avoid being pulled back into that view of school is useless and frustrating, and I hate this, but I have to memorize it, and I don't know why. Those kind of stories that tend to play inside the
That's
minds of
right.
high
That's
school.
right. And we said just like so powerfully and reminds me of last week or last week, I interviewed a young man. He just turned 15 and he's an amazing entrepreneur. He loves games. So what he did was that he turned that passion. He became a game developer and his
Yeah.
games got like 2 million downloads. He was also growing a TikTok community. He was creating online courses, selling his games, teaching other people how to create games. And I asked him, this is really incredible, right? I was like, what are the challenges and roadblocks that you had to overcome to get to where you are today? You know what he told me? He said,
Hmm.
school. He said, school is my biggest
Yeah.
roadblock. And then now I'm listening to you talk about how much you love learning. I was like, wow, it's just like so different. I think,
Yeah.
do you feel like because of your experience, like as an unschooler and this real life experience, do you think that is the biggest factor that we are seeing two different scenarios?
Do I think that unschooling is the biggest factor?
Yeah, and your real life experience.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think
Mm.
nothing has influenced my life like unschooling has. One point that I'd love to talk about, it kind of builds off of what your friend said or what your last interviewer said, is it's actually really difficult to get a human being, particularly a human kid, to stop being curious. We
Wow.
have this like incredible drive to learn and to discover the world and to find our connection to it as human beings. It's so intuitive to
Mm.
us. And if you were to strategically devise some kind of system to stop kids from being curious, you'd end up with something that looks very much like school, you know, which is horrifying.
I
Like, in the modern world of, entrepreneurship and understanding kind of the roles that human beings can have in building a wonderful place, a wonderful society, like curiosity and creativity and passion is so clearly
mm,
what should be the priority in
mm.
individual development. But school wasn't built for that. School is built for the Industrial Revolution and producing factory workers who are not going to ask questions or question authority.
Yeah,
Uh, and
yeah.
so it's not what we think it is. It's
So
not teaching us to learn.
yeah, you said it so powerfully, right? It's so hard to stop a kid from being curious. But then, in most classes in higher education that I taught, I was like, there's really no spark. There was a study that came out a few years ago. They analyze how many questions students ask, like from young age to older age. And for 5 years old students, on average, every hour they ask 107 questions. 4 years old, 5 years old. That's
Yeah.
amazing, right? But this is crazy. By the time they become like get to high school, they ask on average 0 to 2 questions per 2 hour period. Was
Yeah.
like when I read the study, I was like, wow, from 107 to 2 questions. But as they grow even older, like the number dropped to zero. They stopped asking questions. That's the students that I was teaching with when I was in college. I was like, wow, this is absolutely not enjoyable to teach those classes. And it's not the students' fault, but actually how the entire system just conditioned them to, as you said, kill their curiosity and ability to ask questions. Very, very powerful. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. And so we have still kind of halfway through. I definitely want to spend some time talking about video games because
Okay.
not only this is my struggle, pretty much everyone who comes to my show, we talk about this. Audience ask me a lot of questions about video games. So you grew up playing with unrestricted access to video games. Is that even right?
Yes, that's true. There were brief periods where my parents kind of experimented with restricting access to video games, but um, they were brief. By and large, we had unrestricted access to video games.
Wow. So what does that even mean? Like for example, if you wake up at like 8 a.m. in the morning, can you just like go play games?
Yes. Um, and so my parents leaned very fully into the unschooling model, which is in essence a model of trusting your kids.
Mm,
And I alluded to this earlier in the show again, that shift in what happens between a high schooler coming home and playing video games and an unschooler playing video games. And the shift is that, like we talked about before, that a high schooler is coming to it, they're depressed, they're looking for kind of a way to address symptoms and cope with kind of the emotional and mental fatigue from school. An unschooler is going through an altogether different internal process. when an unschooler watches TV or plays a video game, they have their passion and their creativity turned on.
Mm.
And so rather than it being this kind of passive experience where they're internally shut down, an unschooler in general playing a video game is connecting very strongly to what they're seeing. And unschoolers, kind of given this choice and this freedom, tend to gravitate to things that they feel are teaching them. You know, we talked a little bit already about kind of this innate curiosity that human, you know, particularly kids, but I think all humans could have. And they'll tend to gravitate towards things that are interesting to them. And so just to give a few examples of kind of what that could look like from first person. For me, when I was a kid, I loved what are called RPG games, which are games where you kind of have a character and you go through a story making decisions. You're usually some kind of hero or some kind of villain. And you're kind of building this character and making decisions that affect the world and kind of seeing the results. And so for me, those games were this really interesting opportunity to, one, explore firsthand like a foreign and fantastical place. You know, if kids have ever watched, if parents have ever watched their kids play games like Skyrim or The Witcher or any of those kind of classic RPG games, the environments are incredible, and just absorbing artistry and seeing these beautiful kind of natural landscapes on its own is incredible. And I'll say just even that, aside from anything else, awoke in me a desire to go and see kind of the real world equivalents of those places in video games. I was so fascinated with the like jungle tropics of a game like Far Cry 3 that I was just like so excited that I had to go to Thailand in real life and explore the jungle because it was so beautiful and I wanted to see it in real life. So that's one piece, is like you're giving your kids a chance to explore the world far more broadly than they can from, you know, where you live. And then as another piece, because the RPG takes on this context of making decisions and seeing the results, what a perfect like social societal simulator for a kid, you know? Like particularly like for me, I was at the time when I really was into video games between like 12 and like 16 years old. And developmentally, that's such a kind of impactful time frame of a kid learning kind of advanced social concepts, you know? And so for me, there was this chance to go into this simulation, effectively is what it was, to try one sort of social avenue. What happens if I, you know, respond to conflict by joining this side and see what happens, you know? And then if I go back in time, I load my save, I respond to conflict joining this side and see how that goes. And then go back in time again, and I respond to conflict instead being a mediator for the two sides. And, you know, it's so different. Like it's just, I just really want to emphasize how impactful it is for a kid to go and see kind of first person, because that's what it is in the game, is you're experiencing it first person, the consequences of extreme actions. You're getting to test kind of what happens if you behave, you know, in ways, and usually writers have scripted in, you know, results to certain actions so you can kind of experience fairly realistic responses to actions you make, and you get to go through them so quickly. You know, you get to make choices that you wouldn't feel comfortable making in real life because they're more extreme sometimes. You get to see, you know, what's real altruism look like, what effect does that have on the world, what does selfishness look like on the world, and you get to kind of integrate those experiences at a way higher rate than you can just by going through sort of the pace of real life. So just as kind of an opportunity for social development on a rapid scale with this really incredible breadth of exploration, that's kind of where I see the really main focus of what was most meaningful to me about video games. And there are so many other ways to engage with it.
Yeah, it's so beautiful. I agree. As Dan commented here, that just listening to you, it's just such a strong. It's just so beautiful. It's just everything like why I can clearly tell that you love learning, you love your life. It's just such a great state. And but like as parent, on the other hand, you also read literature on children playing too much game. They become addicted. They cannot focus. Someone even talking about becoming more violent. And do you like, what do you think about those like kind of popular mainstream media? Like, what do you think about this perspective? Do you
Yeah.
experience any side effect as a result of playing lots of games?
So I think a lot of the media that kind of paints video games in a negative light. At least one kind of major note against their credit is that I think they're by and large examining school kids playing video games. And I think, like we said before, that's an important difference. While I'm sure there are kids who manage to manage their trauma from school well enough that they can still have an engaged relationship to games at home. I'm sure that happens. I think though, by and large, the more common experience is kids coming home from school and using video games as a coping mechanism for kind of the ongoing suppression they're facing in their daily lives. And in that context, it makes a lot of sense to me that a kid treats a video game then not as an avenue of creative expression, fulfillment of curiosity, but instead as kind of their basic way of getting their core needs for rest and peacefulness met. And so kid or adult, doesn't really matter. If you take away a person's avenue, or their believed avenue to getting those core needs met, they don't react well. And so like if you think about video games as a response in the context of trauma to suppression, it makes a lot of sense that you would see reactions like restricting a kid's access to video games and then getting really unhappy and really combative towards you really quickly. Because you can think about it sort of as like, taking away coffee from an adult, or, like telling a grown-up that they can't like cuddle with their spouse after work anymore. It's like for a kid, like this is their way. This is what they have of like making peace within themselves. And so I think that some of that perception from parents of seeing their kids react really negatively and aggressively towards loss of access to video games is better looked at in kind of this with school as the cause and video games as the symptom. Like video games are a chosen response to like a system of suppression rather than the source of suppression. Does that make sense, that distinction?
Wow, you just like, I'm having massive paradigm shifts right now. Very powerful. Like literally, wow, that's so powerful. It is now as I think about it. Yeah. So we are actually looking at the wrong picture, right? We're like analyzing, criticizing those kids who have all those issues, but not as a result of video games. But video games is just the vehicle to show the symptom.
That's the tip of the iceberg,
Yeah, that's powerful. So like clearly you have a very healthy relationship with video games. So is that very common among your circle of unschoolers? Is that like just people don't feel like, oh, this is something I have access now, and but like you, very healthy relationship with video games?
Yeah, absolutely. And we talked about there are different ways. Like I have some friends who kind of around the same time as me were unschoolers and got into games. And for me, the part that really spoke to me in video games was this kind of like social simulator and like adventure simulator. And I went on to get really excited as an adult about traveling and then working professionally as a mediator and a communication skills teacher. Other friends of mine, I'm thinking of a particular friend who loved sci-fi. He loved technology in video games. He loved seeing kind of different prepositions of physics at play in this kind of theoretical context of a game. So for example, a really accessible game called Portal is one of just the classics in video games. It shows, what's kind of the basic result of being able to open a portal between two places in the world at once. For a kid who loves sci-fi, that's just amazing to be able to like test firsthand experience what's this major scientific breakthrough that quantum physicists might be aspiring to look like when experienced. And now that friend is in college studying physics and engineering. Like it's these really clear lines where an unschooler finds access to an experience of the thing they love, and if they keep loving it, they'll continue asking questions about it until they need answers that can only be received at a higher level of education or a pursuit through a professional line.
I love it. I think, I'm like, today I'm going to let my kids play more games. So is that like, oh, like, like your parents are clearly very supportive of this, right? So other days
Yeah.
you just like spending a long time from the TV or computer playing games, and your parents like, just they respect you. They just like, yeah, that's amazing. I love it.
Yeah, I have this one experience, and to me, these two things are the same, even though to an adult they might seem different. There were phases that I had as a kid where I was into music, and I would spend hours and hours in my room on my computer recording. I would play my guitar or sing, and listen to it back and add tracks to it in my computer. That still might look to an adult like kind of meaningless computer time, to me, and I think this is more kind of clear when the example is music, only because that's already sort of culturally associated with creative engagement. But I was so clearly learning, and I have this really clear memory of being, I think I was 16 or something like that, and I was recording, and I was just really onto something. I was having so much fun and felt like I was learning a lot. And my dad came in the room. We had like a family dinner planned or something like that. And he was, asking me to come to dinner. And I remember being there and saying something like, "Dad, I get it, but I'm really in the zone with this recording. Like it's really like I think I'm really getting somewhere." And my dad's response is what sticks out to me now. In the moment, it didn't seem unusual, but he immediately was, "Oh, of course, record." And he closed the door and he went with zero pressure for me to come to the family dinner. And that was kind of in the moment like a normal experience for me, that my parents prized my kind of like creative engagement with whatever I was working on so highly. But I think in hindsight, that's really different from how most kids grow up. Most kids don't grow up with their parents just unquestioningly on board with whatever it is they're creatively engaged with. And that degree of support, that degree of trust from my parents, I think was radically transformative in how I'm able to view and engage with the world today.
That is so powerful, and I can so relate, right? Like I'm an entrepreneur. When I do my business, I'm really into it. I would hate it if someone grabbed me away. Hey, it's time to do that. Like, why do you interrupt my flow? I would be so mad. But we do that to our children all the time. That is so powerful.
Yeah. There's this really kind of consistently believed tendency towards disrespecting children. In a way that we would not disrespect adults. And if you just undo that assumption that
Yeah.
kids shouldn't get to have direct choice over whatever they're doing, then
Yeah.
you're doing unschooling.
Yeah. 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 And another question, we're just going to wrap this up soon.
Sure.
And I hear a lot is that, with unschoolers, that you are giving them so much freedom, autonomy, and you are going to foster this tendency to do things that they don't really want to do, right? Avoiding things. Do you see that, or you think that argument is not valid?
I mean, yes and no. What'll sometimes happen, one question I get a lot about unschooling is, how do kids learn math, or how do kids learn how to read? Some people view those as really basic subjects that are really useful, in your day-to-day life, that usually school would force upon you kind of for your own good. What usually happens in unschooling is, eventually, when you're in something you love, it will take you by necessity into any subjects that are relevant to your understanding and your ability to engage with your passion. So for me, I loved stories. I loved video games. I loved social environments. I was very naturally drawn towards taking some of my first college classes when I think I was 15. I took my first community college course in composition and literature because I wanted to understand stories a little bit better in the way they played out in games. And so there's I already knew how to read because I had been in school. There's other examples. I'm sure you've already talked to students who've explored this question more deeply. But what tends to happen is, so again, for my friend who's an engineer, or an engineering student, he loved video games, loved sci-fi, and because he loved those things, it then made sense for him to start learning how to build computers, because he wanted to play games with a more advanced graphics card, and that was the cheapest way to do it. And it made sense for him to learn how to efficiently read technical manuals on instructions for assembling computers. It made sense for him to learn mathematics as he got more advanced in understanding how some of the components of computers work, so that he can kind of differentiate between what he's researching. As you engage with your passion, the skills that are relevant to your passion kind of become essential parts of your learning pathway. And then this really important thing happens. You're engaging with that material in alignment with your passion rather than by force. And when you're learning reading because it's essential to your passion, it's just so much more meaningful.
Yeah, I love it. I was just thinking about my own business, right? Because I didn't really take all the classes related to business. I think if I did that, I would never ever start a business, because oh my God, I just feel so overwhelmed with so much information. But now I learned one thing, I implemented to my business, and I failed, and I go back, I learn something. So I learn one thing, I implement, and then I go back, I learn another thing, I implement. It's not like you learn the entire textbook of how to run a business, and then you kind of forget everything, how do I even get started? So that is the biggest difference between school and what you're talking about here.
Yeah, there's that trial and error, right? That's so natural to human learning, but just so non-existent in school.
Yeah, I love it. Thank you so much, Xander. Yes, my cat has joined us. Yeah. You really give me lots of, as I said, paradigm shift, especially in terms of video games. And so that is something I personally struggle with, this or that. And I read lots of books, The Reality is Broken, all those things talking about the benefits of video games, but sometimes still very hard to watch your kids just play all the time. So thank you for really doing this interview. And my last question is, I think someone asked, if you have children in the future, would you homeschool or unschool your own kids?
Oh, no hesitance. Absolutely.
Oh, love it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I love it. So share some resources that I think people should check out more if they're interested in learning more about unschooling, or if where people can connect with you and follow you on your learning journey.
Great. So you're welcome to post sort of social media links to me in whatever description is available on these videos. As for other resources, one I love to give a shout out to is Not Back to School Camp. That's this really awesome, and you have a link there, great. It's a summer camp for kids in alternative education, and particularly caters towards unschoolers. And for me, when I was a teenager, it was this really helpful way to kind of bridge the gap between what I could experience in my home and like kind of the learning available to me there, and then coming to this camp and connecting with other kids from all over the country and sometimes the world, and getting a much broader perspective on kind of what's possible, what things I can learn, what ideas I can integrate into my own life, and helping kind of, take the step from exploring on my own to exploring the world more broadly with companionships. I love shouting out School Camp. I think it's a really tremendous resource for kids in unschooling environments. As for learning more about unschooling, a lot of what I've said here is in some ways an echo of a really great TED Talk by Sir Ken Robinson. Some of you I'm sure have already heard, but if not, I think it's one of the really core materials for learning more about unschooling. I don't think he's even specifically talking about unschooling, just the paradigm of school, but I think it really well builds towards this conclusion that we're discussing.
Oh yeah, today. He's such a visionary. I read all of his books. I just love, and his TED Talk is the #1. Do schools kill creativity? I mean, that's the #1 watch TED Talk. That is very powerful. It shows how many people resonate with this message. Yeah. Awesome. Thank you so much, Xander, for spending an entire hour with us. This is one of my favorite interviews. So thank you. I really appreciate it. Yeah.
My pleasure. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, nice to meet you too. Yeah.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, and thank you so much, everyone, for joining us live. And next Friday, I actually have Unschooling Mom to Mom. Do you follow her? Unschooling Sue?
I don't, but I'll have to tune in.
Yeah, she's like another pioneer in the unschooling movement. So I will have her back on the show to talk more about video games and technology. So if you guys are interested in that, and definitely come join us again next Friday, and same time, same location. And thank you so much to those of you who are watching the replay, and also check out Not Back to School and follow Xander on social media. Bye, everyone.